Hey, welcome back. In this video, I want to wrap up the lesson by talking about DNS. Now, DNS is important because it provides a means for emails reaching recipients within your organization. Suppose, for instance, that somebody in the outside world sends an email message to somebody at your organization. How does that email get there? Well, obviously, it travels through the internet, but there has to be some kind of means of determining the exact place where that email message is supposed to go. And that's where DNS comes into play. Because when somebody in the outside world sends an email message, at some point in the process, their system looks up on a DNS server to find the IP address of your mail server. That IP address is listed within an MX record for your domain. So, how does this all work? Well, I'll be perfectly frank with you and tell you that there are several different ways that DNS can be configured. Sometimes DNS is mapped directly to a mail server. In other cases, it might be mapped to an edge server. In still other cases, it could be mapped to your corporate firewall. So what I've got on this slide is a very common example of how DNS can be configured. So if you look at the diagram up here, you can see this line right here. This represents an internet connection coming into an organization. And then we have a perimeter firewall. And then behind the firewall, we have an edge server that resides in the DMZ. And then behind the edge server, we have another firewall. There isn't always a firewall here, but a lot of organizations try to improve security a bit by using a secondary firewall. And then behind that firewall, we have a mailbox server. So what happens is that when email comes into the organization, it passes through the internet link, through the firewall to the edge server, and then the edge server acts as a proxy and forwards that mail to a mailbox server, where it's eventually placed into the recipient's mailbox. So that's in a nutshell how the process works. So where does DNS come into play in this? Well, in this particular case, what we would do is we would map the DNS record to the perimeter firewall. So I don't want to give away the IP address of my real firewall, but we'll just use 192.168.0.1 and pretend that's the firewall address. So what would happen is we would set the DNS MX record for the domain to 192.168.0.1. And that would tell any foreign mail systems that any email messages that are destined for a recipient within my organization need to get sent to this IP address. So those email messages arrive at the firewall, not the edge server, not the mailbox server, but the perimeter firewall. So what happens then? Well, the firewall would need to be configured with a port forwarding rule that would forward mail from the firewall to the edge server. And then from there, the edge subscription would take over and would make sure that those messages get moved to a mailbox server, which in turn places the mail into a recipient's mailbox. So let's take a look at how this all works. I'm going to take just a moment. I'm going to switch over to my firewall, and I'll show you how you might set up a port forwarding rule. And then once I've done that, I'll pull up a DNS server and I'll show you how to create an MX record. Now, before I do all of this, I need to point out that what I'm about to show you is specific to my organization, because even though DNS is a standard, every provider of DNS has their own interface that they map to that DNS. So for example, an internet hosting provider might use one interface, whereas the DNS that comes with Windows Server uses a completely different interface. All of the underlying mechanisms are the same, but the user interface varies from provider to provider. And the same thing goes for firewalls. I'm going to be using a consumer grade firewall, but odds are those of you who are watching this video are probably going to be using a business oriented or an enterprise grade firewall. And it's going to look a little bit different, even though the mechanisms that I'm going to be showing you exist within your firewall as well. So with that said, let me switch over and we'll take a look at the firewall portion of this. Okay, so here I am on my firewall, and you'll notice that I'm in the port forwarding, port triggering section. So even though this is just a Netgear consumer grade firewall, this is very similar to what you would find on an enterprise grade firewall. So what we need to do is create a port forwarding rule, and you can see that I've selected port forwarding. And what you would generally do is associate a service with an IP address. So if I click the down arrow on service, we have a lot of different choices: FTP, HTTP, ICUI, IP phone, net meeting, news, Quake, real audio, telnet, VPN, PPTP. There's no listing for mail. If there were a listing for mail, we would simply choose mail and then enter an IP address. So what we would have to do, since there's no listing for mail, is add a custom service. So I would click add a custom service, and then I would enter a name for the service, presumably mail. I would enter a port number, and then I would enter a server IP address. This would be the IP address that's associated with my edge server. In this case, that address is 147, 100, 100, 239. Now, incidentally, I don't own this IP address range. It's basically a random range that I picked out over 20 years ago for use in my lab, and it's just kind of stuck. So this isn't something that I own or anything like that. Now, I would love to be able to show you exactly how to go through the entire process, but I can't click Add Custom Service without showing you the device mappings for everything on my network, and I really don't want to compromise my security in the interest of a demo. But anyhow, this is how you would go about adding a port forwarding rule. So basically what we're doing is we're telling the firewall that if any traffic of the specified type, whether it be FTP, HTTP, whatever, comes into the network, then what you would do is you would forward that traffic to the address that's specified. That's all that a port forwarding rule does. So now, having said that, let me switch over to DNS and I'll show you what the DNS portion of the process looks like. The domain name that I'm using throughout this entire video series is posydemo.com, and I've registered that domain on GoDaddy. So right now I'm logged into the GoDaddy website, which you can see right here. And I've gone ahead and gone into the domain settings. I've got a lot of domains, so I just went straight to PosyDemo. And here you can see the basic settings for the domain, and then I've got DNS zone file. If I click on DNS zone file, it pulls up all of the DNS records that are currently associated with this domain. Right now, none of these really do anything because this is just a demo domain that I created specifically for doing these types of videos. So let's suppose that we want to add a mail record. Well, what we do is we click Add Record. And then I'm taken to the Add Zone Record dialog box. Well, the first thing that we have to do is specify a record type. Right now, this is defaulting to a service record or an SRV record, but I can click the down arrow and I can choose an MX record, a mail exchanger record. And you can see that the fields that are required change based on the type of record that I select. So what do we do next? Well, we've got three fields that have to be filled in: host, points to, and priority. And we've got informational bubbles next to each of these, and I can click on these informational bubbles and those will tell me what to put into these particular fields. But one trick that I've learned over the years is that if you need a little bit of extra help, sometimes, it doesn't work in every environment, but sometimes you can look at default DNS records. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this, and you can see that there are a couple of MX records that are created by default by GoDaddy. These aren't anything that I put into place. These were there when I created the domain name. And if I click Edit, we can see how these records are populated. So host is just @ points to, and this is the fully qualified domain name where the DNS record is going to point. And then we have a priority and a time to live. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this, and I'm going to go back to Add Record, and I'm going to choose an MX record. So host, we'll set this to the @ points to, and what we would do here is we would add the fully qualified domain name of the host where we want our mail delivered. Well, remember, we're not delivering mail to a host. We're delivering it to the firewall, which is going to use port forwarding rules to forward the mail to a host. So what we would do here is enter the firewall's IP address. Now, as I said before, I don't want to give my real firewall IP address, but I can use the imaginary IP address that I made up, which was 192.168.0.1. And then priority, we can set this to anything that we want. I'm just going to set the priority to 10, and TTL is fine at 1 hour, so I'll click Finish. And of course, I get an error because this isn't a real IP address. This is a non-routable IP address. But that's how you would normally go about creating the DNS record. And once that DNS record is created, then that would cause all mail flow for the intended domain to go to the IP address that's been specified. That IP address is, of course, associated with the firewall. The firewall receives that mail and uses a port forwarding rule to forward the mail to an edge server, which in turn relays that mail to a mailbox server where the mail is placed in the recipient's mailbox. So that's how DNS server records are configured and how they play into the whole Exchange server configuration process.